It's great to welcome economist Richard Wolff back to the program. He is Professor Emeritus of Economics at my alma mater, the University of Massachusetts. He was actually my Econ 104 professor back in, I guess it must have been 2002 or 2003. The new book is Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown 2010 to 2014. There's so much material in this book, and I thought to sort of get us into the conversation, there's a few things I want to focus on. Recently, part of the problem that I've experienced in thinking about the failings and successes of capitalism is that the mere mention of the topic is almost instantly derailed by many with these manichaeistic discussions of, well, are you a communist? Is that what you mean when you say, let's explore the failings of capitalism? Is this particularly problematic now, or has this always been a challenge when we want to sort of discuss capitalism?
Well, it comes and goes, David. The truth of it is, there have always been critics of capitalism. Indeed, it's not even fair to capitalism to pick out capitalism itself. There have been critics of slavery when it was the dominant system. There were critics of feudalism when it was the dominant system. The history of the human race, not surprisingly, finds that whatever the economic system you have, there are people who love it, people who hate it, and all kinds of people in between. And indeed, it would be an unhealthy society if everybody loved it without criticism, or everybody hated it. Indeed, if everybody felt that way, the system wouldn't last very long, to say the least. So I think it's a good sign that societies in general have people who are differing in their opinions. The critics have a very special function, which is to point out what's not working well, because if you don't have that, then you don't fix the problems, and then they only get worse. It's a little bit like dealing with problems in your physical health or your mental health. They tend to be better handled if you face up to them rather sooner than later and deal with them. So I would say that capitalism has always had its critics. It's always had its defenders. And sometimes the two sides kind of get a little lopsided and go over the top. And what you point to is one way that the defenders have done that, by attacking critics as if to be critical of capitalism is tantamount or equal to being a particular devotee of one or another system, being a devotee of something evil or bad or dangerous, particularly after the end of World War II. When we had our big anti-communist turn in the United States, the McCarthy era, all of that, it became for quite some decades virtually impossible to be a critic of capitalism because you were immediately attacked for being somehow an advocate of our great enemy, the Soviet Union, or communism, or some awful stereotype about what communism might be. I'm very happy to say that that's fading now, that we are in a time when, in part because the Soviet Union isn't there anymore, and because of changes in the People's Republic of China, the whole notion of the great enmity between capitalism and socialism is really much reduced, and it's possible to discuss these issues without the hysteria that attended it, say, from 1945 to the year 2000. And I think you can see it most obviously in the fact that Bernie Sanders, who accepts the label socialist, is not only able to run for the presidency, but to do far, far better than anyone, by the way, himself included, had any reason to foresee as little as a year ago. So I think we're becoming a healthy society, able and willing to let the debate, which should have been there all along anyway, let that debate restart itself. What is good and bad about capitalism? What needs to be fixed? Ought we to be thinking about doing better than capitalism? These are healthy debates. They should be going on. And I'm happy to say we seem to be at a moment in our history when we're going in precisely that direction.
Along these lines, you have an essay in the new book, Capitalism's Ideological Crutches. And oftentimes, what we see is the sort of public expression in favor or against a particular policy is not, it's a sort of a sign of what are the underlying ideologies that someone may support or oppose. You know, a good example is when we talk to people who are against abortion and against access to birth control, when I explain, well, you know, actually access to birth control reduces abortion, it doesn't matter because the underlying ideology is sort of what I call strict father morality, which is if you do the wrong thing, which is, you know, what have sex outside of marriage or whatever the case may be, you sort of deserve to be pregnant and should be forced to carry the child to term, right? There's an underlying ideology that makes the specifics sort of irrelevant when you are confronted with them. What are the underlying ideological crutches that capitalism is based on if you believe that it is the best system?
Well, I think one of the fundamental notions is that human beings are innately individualistic, that they care mostly about themselves, that they look at other people as instrumental means to get more or better for yourself. Greediness is somehow inherent in the human makeup, and that capitalism is a way of harnessing, controlling these basic human qualities in such a way that we get the best possible outcome. It's the implicit notion is the alternative is for a powerful government to control us, to keep us from being too mean-spirited, too individualistic, too self-centered. But then again, that carries the danger of what that government will do and what the individuals who control it will do, so that capitalism becomes in some way the best framework for harnessing a human nature that isn't looked at in very positive ways. And somehow capitalism then gets the credit for making us more productive with one another, given our awful natures, than we would otherwise be able to be.
What's interesting to me about that is some of the traits you listed at the beginning, beliefs about humans, human traits, some of those are at least partially true. I mean, certainly when you compare humans to bees, for example, the sense of individualism and the sense of greed and how one fits into the bigger picture. I mean, there's no doubt that to some extent, I think those traits do exist in humans. But in my mind, those would be reasons to have a system that maybe would counterbalance those instincts rather than feed into them.
Not only that, I think most modern psychology teaches that most of us have in us what would be called contradictory impulses, desires, needs. Yes, there's a part of us that is individualistic and selfish and all of that. But there are likewise, and it's not so hard to find endless examples of us as cooperating human beings, as motivated by feelings of love, of solidarity, of empathy, and all of that. And that perhaps you might want to say that we have the capacity to go in a variety of different directions. And as many critics of capitalism have pointed out, the fundamental flaw in their minds with capitalism is it goes way further than we ought to reward and encourage those parts of the human being that are selfish, are greedy, and then justifies itself as if it wasn't encouraging them, but simply managing what is an inherent part of the human condition. And so I think, and I am myself a critic, I don't pretend to be otherwise, that capitalism bears no small part of the responsibility for those very attributes of the human being that they then turn around and claim they are only accommodating, when in fact I think they exaggerate and underscore them. And I think at least we ought to give a try to alternative systems in a very experimental way to see whether and how they can do better.
There are some who would sort of accept the majority of that argument about the ideological crutches of capitalism, and they may take what they believe to be a higher level view, which is, yeah, you're probably right that this is a system that is encouraging or nurturing some of those instincts which exist to varying degrees in humans. But the thing is, it's the most efficient system, that it's the organization of our economy and society that is most efficient. But that's really not true, is it?
No, and I think there are two ways to show that it's not true. One is historical. It is easy to show that for much of the history of slavery in the centuries that it existed, likewise for much of the history of feudalism that existed in Europe, for example, in the 1,000 years before capitalism became the system, that there were countless numbers of people who said exactly the same things about those systems, that slavery is the most efficient way to get things done, that human beings naturally, or if you're religious, by virtue of God's will, fall into two categories, masters and slaves. And by organizing slavery, you get the slaves to do a lot of work, which could only be organized by the masters who have that capacity, and that's the most efficient system.
And this is also present in older caste systems. Is that not right?
Absolutely. In other words, a standard defense of the status quo throughout human history has been the claim that it's the most efficient thing that has ever existed up until that moment. And then as the enthusiasm bubbles over, it becomes the most efficient thing that could ever be, past, present, or future. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are people in a capitalist system of the sort we have in the world today who have found their way to the same formulation. We are the most efficient that has ever been, and that bubbles over into we are the most efficient that can ever be. And my point is simply, it was always false before. How in the world should we be expected to believe that suddenly, this time, it's correct? But there's a more profound criticism. The very notion of efficiency is fundamentally flawed and absurd. Let me briefly explain. Economists, of which I'm one, do a kind of assessment of anything that happens in the past, in the present. Let me give you a concrete example. A hospital is trying to figure out whether they ought to build another wing for certain kinds of illnesses. And they call in economists to do what's called a cost-benefit analysis, to assess what are all the costs of building a new wing on the one hand, and what are all the benefits of building a new wing on the other, to measure each of them once you know what they all are, and then if the benefits add up to more than the costs, why then you go ahead and do it because it is an efficient thing to do. And if in fact the costs outweigh the benefits, you don't do it because it isn't efficient. This is a lovely fable, this kind of story I've just told, but let me tell you why it's a fable. And it's simple. No one knows, no one can know what all the consequences of any act are. Whether you build a wing of the hospital, or you raise an interest rate, or you lower a tax level, whatever economic event you want to point to, the task of identifying all of the positive consequences and all of the negative ones is in principle impossible to do. One of the simplest reasons, because many of the effects won't happen until next year, or 3 years from now, or 10 years from now. And unless human beings have acquired capabilities no one has ever seen, we don't know what's going to happen 2, 5, 10 years from now.
Yeah, but there is a counterpoint to that, isn't there? There is sort of a counterpoint to that, which is fine. We can't possibly, to a 100% certainty, measure all of the impacts 50 years out, but over time we get better at getting to 95%, and maybe that's good enough. Not that that justifies the system, to be clear, but at least to say we're good enough at assessing what the consequences would be. I mean, maybe the standard is too high if you say we have to be able to, beyond any doubt, ascertain 100% of the consequences.
No, unfortunately, I wish it were as easy to resolve as that, but it isn't. Let me explain why.
Yeah.
We don't know what the variables are and how they will change.
Ah.
It's only you only know that you're getting 95% if those that you're not getting can be somehow thought to be only 5% of what you would otherwise know. But you never know that. You never know whether the results of something you're contemplating that won't happen for the future will be the very big ones that make everything go, oh, we shouldn't do it,
Sure.
or will be a very small one. There's no way to know that, because in order for you to know what you're not measuring and that it's small, you have to know all of it to know that they're the small ones. You can't do that beforehand. But let me finish. There's even another way.
Yeah.
When we say we look at the consequences of something, like building a new wing, and let's say one of the consequences we find is such and such a traffic pattern will have to be rerouted where this wing of the hospital is built, and that will cause more traffic jams and maybe even more accidents, and we have to figure that in. Here's the problem. Those things I just referred to as consequences of building the hospital's new wing are never, let me underscore that, never just the consequences of that. In other words, what happens to traffic in that area will also be affected to what is happening to the construction of automobiles, of tires, of the materials used in the street, of lighting patterns on city streets at night, of the you can figure it out. It's a million factors, so that you can't even know when you measure a quote effect of what you're looking at, that it's the effect just of that, which makes the whole exercise of identifying and measuring absurd. You can't do it. No one has ever, it's nothing we should feel bad about. We can't do that kind of thing. It's a bit magical. You know, when we read as children Superman comics, and there's this lovely fellow who does good by flying around the community, we kind of understand, A, that nobody can do that, we can't do that, but we enjoy the fantasy. Well, efficiency is the same thing. We can't know the consequences of what we do. We never could, and that gives us a certain sense of weakness, of smallness, of insecurity about our decisions, all of which is understandable. But then we make magic. Suddenly, out of our insecurity about our decisions and the inherent unknowability of their consequences, we have magically created the notion, oh boy, we can do the undoable. We can actually find out what the consequences are, measure them, and only do those that work out nicely. It's a fantasy. It's never been doable. For every example you could find where somebody said X would happen in the future and therefore this is good to do, I can find you one where the exact same calculations were made and the end result was completely different from what had been foreseen. And I think, therefore, this notion of efficiency ought to be demoted from this magical role it plays in our society. You know, the real truth of it is, and I've been in these scenes many times in my life, to stay with my example, the hospital wants to build a wing. But let's say that requires destroying a bunch of homes and wrecking a particular neighborhood. Not surprisingly, the people who live there don't want this, and they say don't do it. But let's say the hospital is all for it, they want to do it. Okay, now there's a public hearing by some city agency. Should we or should we not issue the licenses to enable the hospital to build the wing? And in come the paid economists like me for the hospital telling everybody why it's efficient to do it. Here come the people in the neighborhood who don't have the money, who don't have the connections, and maybe they get a volunteer economist like me to come in and do as best he can with his free time and no budget. Well, guess what? Each side says what they think the efficiencies are, but the ones with the bells and whistles and the beautiful charts and all the right press credentials will win the case. But believe me, it has nothing to do with efficiency. It has to do with who brings the bigger gun to the gunfight,
right.
And that's the one who wins.
Well, you're channeling our friend Donald Rumsfeld. Those unknown unknowns are really the key to this whole thing. The book is fantastic. We're talking about economist Richard Wolff's book, Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Dozens of topics like these in the book. Thanks as always for joining me.
Thank you, David, and I look forward to talking with you again in the future.